Hey everybody, today I wanted to talk a little bit about three basic elements of document design that we're going to revisit again and again throughout this semester. The first element that we have to think about when we're creating a document is, of course, text. Textual elements. What are you going to say and how are you going to say it? The actual words that you are using to communicate your message. That is what textual elements of design are all about. Now, there are several ways that you can manipulate a text, right? There are several ways that you can use textual elements to communicate more effectively with your reader. Typeface, size, all that sort of thing, right? We're basically thinking about how are you manipulating a text? How are you manipulating the actual visual appearance of the letters to make your text more accessible? Now, one of the clearest examples of textual elements being used to communicate more effectively would come in the form of serif versus sans-serif fonts. A serif is essentially when you see a letter in Times New Roman or maybe Garamond or basically of many different types of typefaces, I guess, instead of just listing them, I guess I should say. Times New Roman. You take a look at that, take a look at Garamond, there are a few things you're going to notice about the letters. And that would be these little flares, these little footies on the bottom and the tops of the alphabet. And the reason why we have those is because they create a kind of an illusion of a line, right, that allows us to line up text for the reader. Back in the olden days, back in the old time printing presses, these serifs served important roles. One was for the printer, the typesetter, the person who was actually taking each of these blocks of letters and putting them in a plate, right? So you used to have separate plates that had each individual letter, and a typesetter would literally take the little plate and set it in the press so that it all lined up in a nice straight line. Now, it served a very important function for the typesetter, but it also serves a very important function for the reader, because the reader can use these lines that the letters essentially create to follow more effectively through a text. That's why if we're taking a look at a document that's created for a print setting, we're thinking a tangible newspaper, right? If you go and you buy a newspaper from a newsstand or the corner store or whatever, you're going to go through there and you're going to say, hey, I noticed that I have these serif fonts. That is, each of the letters has that little footy that lines up and creates a nice line. The reason why is it helps the reader to read more efficiently without skipping lines and that sort of thing. Now, because the eye follows that along easily, it can also create visual noise. In a printed setting, it's a very important function that allows us to read more efficiently and effectively without skipping content, without skipping lines. But if you go into a digital environment, you're going to see that most online writing is dominated by the sans serif. Sans serif, sans being French for no serif, right? Without the serif. And so when you are in a digital environment, sometimes that extra visual noise can be exhausting for the reader. Many of you might have experienced that in the wake of COVID-19, when we've had so much screen time, it's driving everybody crazy. Everybody's getting the screen fatigue, right? And if you had a lot of serif fonts that are meant to be read online, you're going to notice that it's a little more exhausting for the eye. It's a little bit busier. It's a little bit, not as it's not as easy to get through the content. Which is why, if you take a look at the syllabus online, when we are plugging in content to Canvas, Canvas by default uses sans serif fonts because it's hoping to eliminate some of that visual noise to make it easier for the reader to process the document. Then again, when you go into my printer-friendly PDF copy of the syllabus, you're going to see that I use Garamond. Because if you're printing it out and you're going to use a printer-friendly document, those little footies are going to help guide the eye across the page. So that's one thing to think about when you're creating a text. how are you going to manipulate the text? How are you going to allow the text to present itself? Are you using a serif font? Are you using a sans serif font? What size are you using? Are you going to use headings that are larger than the rest of the text? The rest of the text, the body text, is going to be smaller. How do you use size to manipulate those texts? Are you going to italicize bits of information, or are you going to underline bits of information? Which back in the old typesetting days, underlining used to be a signal to the typesetter to italicize that font. Now we have underlining, the ability to underline text and to italicize text, and we use those elements differently given different elements of design. So those are essentially textual elements of design, how you would use that to effectively provide information or present information to your reader. Spatial elements of design is the next area I want to go, and these are the things like, how do you use space? All right, we're talking about text alignment. All right, are you left aligning? Are you using a center alignment? Are you using a right alignment? Are you justifying a text? So if you take a look at a newspaper, you will again see some spatial elements coming into play. They use columns, and they're organizing the content into columns. Why? Shorter columns. Oops, can't spell today. Thinner columns are less exhausting for the eye to follow, right? If your eye had to follow the entire breadth of a newspaper, it's going to be a lot more exhausting to read because your eye is going to be more likely to skip lines again. Your eye has to go all the way over here and then come all the way back, and it's a less efficient means of presenting information. If you are writing a newspaper, you want people to be able to access information as quickly and as efficiently as possible. So you'll see narrow columns that doesn't involve a lot of eye movement. Your eye is easily able to skim that text and gets through it very efficiently. So the use of columns to organize your text, using justified print makes it look cleaner because the human eye likes lines, right? We like straight, crisp lines when we're dealing with printed text. And so making sure things line up. If you had left-aligned documents, you'd see this ragged edge along the right margin. And that right margin with that ragged edge would look ugly, right? It wouldn't be as appealing as a justified straight up and down line where the text is exactly the same length and it starts and stops on the same sides of the page. Same thing goes with most novels. If you go to most printed novels, professionally published novels, you're going to notice that the right and left margins are usually justified. They are usually going to be, unless one line is significantly shorter than the other, like we're talking, you get to the end of a paragraph and there's only 2 words there versus the 15 words that are in the other lines. In those cases, you'll see that is over here. But generally speaking, most of the text appears justified because they are trying to create a professional appearance. It's more appealing to the eye. So, alignment of a text, using columns, how you are going to balance layout. So if you're thinking about a PowerPoint presentation, it's very pleasing to the eye if you have images that are diagonally, and then you have text that kind of staggers. That's a well-balanced PowerPoint slide. You could have a PowerPoint slide that has texts, and then you could have images kind of offset. That's again fairly balanced as long as your text boxes are using the space well. However, if you have a PowerPoint slide that has, let's say, an image here and text here, and you have a lot of white space over there, that's distracting. It looks empty. It doesn't look like it is a functional text so much. So whenever we're thinking about the way we're using space, space helps us to make information more appealing, more pleasing to the eye. If it's better designed, if it's designed more effectively, people are going to stay with that information a little bit more easily. If it's aesthetically pleasing, people are going to, generally speaking, be able to access that information more effectively, more efficiently. So that's what we think about when we think about spatial design. How do you use the space? Graphic elements of design are pretty self-explanatory. That's photographs, drawings, visuals, like charts, graphs, right? So those kinds of things. Graphic elements also include simple things like bullets, bullet statements. That comes into play a lot of times when we're thinking about our resumes. How often, I mean, many of you have written resumes already. How often do you see big boxes of text on your resume? Not usually very often. If you're thinking about, and we're going to talk about this in the job application packet unit, where we're going to apply some of these same principles, but a lot of times we use bullets in our resume to more efficiently list information and content in a way that is going to be more accessible to our audience. The use of bullets, the decision to use bullets, is a graphic element. The decision to use lines, not talking specifically about underlines, but if we're talking about lines that separate headers or headings, lines between two columns of text, which sometimes you'll see, you can add that extra line in between two columns of text. Those lines are graphic elements that are used for organizational purposes, right? So you will use different graphics to organize text, to present information, and to ensure that your audience is able to access the content effectively and efficiently. Okay? So, to recap, there are three basic elements of document design that we're going to come to again and again throughout this semester. And we're going to talk about specific examples of how we're going to incorporate these elements of design into your different texts. So when we're creating our job application packet, there will be a discussion where I will have a resume, a true resume, a real resume that was done several years ago by a student here at Stout. I am sharing that because it could be improved a lot, right? It's a resume that's decent content, but the layout, the way the information is provided, it becomes problematic. So for that reason, we're going to take a look at a sample resume that was poorly designed. We're going to take a look at sample texts that were poorly designed, and we're going to show you how different elements of textual, spatial, and graphic design will actually help us to make the information more accessible to our audience. So that is your introductory lesson on textual, spatial, and graphic elements of design. If you have any questions regarding this, please let us know in the general inquiry forum. But there will be some other further discussions that we're going to incorporate over the next couple of weeks, where we will see how we can apply this information to texts that you will create for this class. In the meantime, whenever you pick up a text in the next few weeks, before we get to some of those other units, what I would like you to do is I would like you to think about, when you're reading something, you're accessing text in your own personal life, if you're accessing information online, if you're accessing content that I've put or other professors have put in Canvas, I would like you to think about how those professors or how those writers are using textual elements, graphic elements, and spatial elements of design in order to make that information more accessible to you. And if you can find places that maybe it's not quite hitting the mark, maybe there are elements that could be improved, I'd like you to make note of those, because those conversations will come in helpful, right, when we go into the further units and we start to discuss these concepts in further units. In the meantime, happy writing, happy reading, and I'll see you guys online.